Welcome to another LPB electronic field trip. I'm Charlie Winham, and we're so glad you could join us today. Before we begin the electronic field trip, I'd like to introduce you to some of our experts who will answer your questions a little later. From left to right, we have from the Louisiana Office of Coastal Protection and Restoration is Executive Director Jerome Zerang. And Michael Massamy is the Invasive Species Coordinator for the Barataria Terrebonne National Estuary Program. We also have Karen McKee. She is a research ecologist for the United States Geological Survey. One and all, thank you so much for being part of this electronic field trip.
Thanks for having us.
And we'll be back in just a minute, so sit back and enjoy the electronic field trip, and we'll hear your questions after this story.
Did you know that over a third of all the seafood consumed in the United States of America is harvested from coastal Louisiana? Did you know that Louisiana produces almost a third of America's natural gas? In fact, over a quarter of all the crude oil and natural gas our nation uses moves through Louisiana's coastal wetlands. And through Louisiana's ports come a surprising percentage of our imported consumer goods. And as for that coffee we enjoy every day, most of it passes through the port of New Orleans. It's not hard to imagine what would happen if coastal Louisiana's infrastructure was crippled by another major storm. So if you think that Louisiana's coastal land loss, one of the biggest ongoing environmental catastrophes in the world, doesn't affect you no matter where you live in the United States, think again. Louisiana harbors 40% of all wetlands in the United States. However, 90% of wetland loss occurs in Louisiana. If the land loss were to continue at the current rate, Louisiana's shoreline could move inland by as much as 33 miles in some areas by the year 2040.
This little spit of land down here is really important to the well-being of this country. We're number one in shrimp. We're number one in oysters, number one in crawfish, number two in finfish, number two in crabs. 35 to 40% of the domestic seafood production in this country comes from Louisiana.
From Pittsburgh to Tulsa, and every place in between, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Lexington, Memphis, Little Rock. All of these cities are served and depend on cargo shipped into the state of Louisiana and into the port of New Orleans.
We basically produce or have energy, oil and gas coming through Louisiana, pipelines and things like that, that fuels the rest of the nation.
Coastal Louisiana is very different from the rest of the states. It's America's coastal heartland. It's a coastline that's challenged today by land loss. And we hear the numbers, a football field every 30 minutes. The bigger picture is we've lost 1,000 square miles of land in the last 50 years. We'll lose 500 more square miles if we don't do anything about it.
If what Louisiana provides to the rest of the United States is so important, how did we let this happen? It came in response to a national disaster.
In 1927, as a response to this great flood, we built a levee system not to protect Louisiana from rainfall that fell on Louisiana, but it was to safely convey floods that happened in the central part of our country to the Gulf of Mexico. Worked really, really well. But inadvertently, what we did was prevent the annual overflows that nourished our wetlands.
We've built levees on the Mississippi River, interrupted the sediment input into the marshes. We've cut canals throughout the wetlands, allowing salt water to intrude far up into freshwater areas. 7,000 years, Mississippi River built this place that we live on. Within the last 75 years, we destroyed it.
For thousands of years, the Mississippi River shifted, building the marshes, ridges, and barrier islands of coastal Louisiana as it sought the quickest route to the Gulf of Mexico. Then we put the river in a straitjacket.
Basically, we've harnessed that delta, not allowed the river to change, and so this has become an eroding environment. Nobody disagrees that this is a time-sensitive issue. You know, when you're losing 20 to 25 square miles a year, if you're not creating 20 to 25 square miles a year, you know, you're losing the battle and it's going away.
For thousands of years, the coastal lands built by the river provided protection from hurricanes. With less and less coastal lands creating a storm buffer, more and more of this vital Louisiana corridor is exposed. And recent disasters have shown us that man-made levees cannot provide enough protection.
The levees without the wetlands create even a false sense of security. If you don't create and maintain the marshes and the barrier islands in front of them, also that levees in the Gulf of Mexico, you have to build it bigger. We probably can't build it fast enough.
Without coastal protection and without the estuarine system being normally and naturally in place, we don't have a system that breaks down surges from hurricanes.
Barrier islands and marshes and ridgelands in southeastern Louisiana's estuary system create friction that slows winds and lessens storm surge.
We're going to have to get far more aggressive. We're going to have, multiple lines of defense. We're going to have to, of course, save our barrier islands. We're going to have to build more friction in the estuary. We're going to have to build more marshes. We're going to have to restore more ridges. It's not just marshes. It's not just ridges. It's not just barrier islands. It's all of the above.
But can we stabilize America's coastal heartland? Can we rebuild land now? There is a solution. The methodology goes by many names.
Pipeline sediment delivery.
Sediment slurries.
Dedicated dredging.
Pipeline slurry.
Dredge bowl.
Dedicated dredge project.
Dredge spoil.
Now it's affectionately called long-distance distribution by pipeline or whatever.
No matter what we call it, put simply, it's harvesting material from one place to restore another. Massive projects that use this pipeline sediment delivery methodology to build land as rapidly as our coast needs rebuilding are happening right now around the world.
Dredge basically is a giant floating vacuum cleaner. It has a head that goes down that cuts the bottom up, and then it pumps that sand mixed up with water to any location that we really want to deposit.
In the past, this technology has been used to destroy the environment. You're dredging channels and you're taking this material and you're taking it out of the system. What we're doing is we're taking material and bringing it into the system.
But how do we know that pipeline sediment delivery will work in an ecosystem as decimated as Louisiana's coast?
Initially, we became interested in this technique of adding sediment slurries to deteriorating marshes in order to revitalize them purely by accident. During the filling of a gas pipeline canal, the sediments that were hydraulically pumped into this pipeline overflowed the confines of the right-of-way and spilled into an adjacent salt marsh that was in a high state of deterioration. And lo and behold, this sediment revitalized this particular marsh.
In marsh restoration, a mix of sediment and water called slurry is fanned out across the restoration area. The pipeline is moved along the site, delivering slurry until the desired elevation is achieved. Soon, vegetation returns, along with animals and marine life.
We found that this particular methodology of adding sediment slurries to wetlands that are subsiding at a very high rate can be a way of remediating and restoring the health and vigor of these coastal wetlands, especially salt marshes. There are definitely areas of marsh that would not come back if sediment was not added.
Just as important are the ridgelands.
But we have chenier ridges, maritime forest ridges, and distributary ridges here in the Mississippi Deltaic Plain.
These natural formations left behind by shifting bayous and rivers are solid underfoot and studded with trees.
When you get up to these natural ridges, they really provide the only relief in the landscape. We're losing these natural ridges just like we're losing marshes in barrier islands, but most of them have been negatively impacted by man.
Ridges provide critical elevation of sometimes just a few feet. In this flat terrain, even such minimal elevation can greatly lessen the impact of storms. This ridge is being built to create bird habitat, but will also serve to protect oil and gas infrastructure.
When the hurricanes of 2005 came through and the service area of the port was shut down, there was over $1 billion a day of product of oil and gas made unavailable to the American public. We were doing coastal restoration before it was cool to do coastal restoration, before people knew what it was, because we just knew we needed to do this to save ourselves. We take a hydraulic dredge, a suction dredge, and we move sediments for 2-3 miles, not a big thing.
First, a ridge to be restored is identified. Then slurry material is added via pipeline. Once the material settles, it's shaped. Restored ridges are planted to reforest the area.
The chenier woods, or maritime forests, are extremely important for a number of species of birds. Shorebirds, wading birds, raptors. Just as important are the tons or the millions of migratory birds that come through coastal Louisiana each year. So they're going to spend their time here twice a year. In the spring, fattening up to continue their journey north, and in the fall, fattening up to continue their journey south.
Beyond marshes and ridgelands is the coast's last buffer to the sea, barrier islands, many of which have eroded to the point of completely disappearing.
Barrier islands mitigate wave impacts when storms come. People refer to them as the first line of defense for storms. We're standing right now on what everyone calls Ile Denier, or Last Island. It's the last piece of land between Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico.
Once the appropriate harvest site is found, a dredge barge is moved into place. When harvesting begins, the cutter head descends. A slurry is sucked in and travels along the pipeline to the restoration site. As the slurry exits the pipe, it is formed by machinery. As one area settles, the pipeline and machinery are shifted to pump in an adjacent area. Once the site is raised to the specified elevation, all machinery is removed, leaving a minimal human footprint.
When the project is finished, any damage that we did and actually building the project should be part of the restoration. For instance, in this project where you see the road constructed for access, that will all be repaired when we leave. And all these dikes you see behind and pipes, that's all going to be removed, that's all going to be shaped down and graded to create a design template of a natural dune system.
Wooden fences are erected to catch sand, creating dunes to further anchor and elevate the island. The restored ecosystem quickly becomes a natural habitat and the first line of defense against storms once again.
Standing on top of a completed dune, you can see these dunes in the back. Those hills that you see with all the vegetation on them, underneath in the middle of it is a fence just like this. These here are already started to make dunes, just in the short time they've been here. Between them, the sand dune is starting to build, and on each side also. So it works pretty fast. On a job like this, you can see you have really built something that's going to do some good, and there's a lot of satisfaction in that.
This landscape was predicted to be washed away by the year 2005, no longer in existence. And here, through pipeline slurry, we've extended the life of this barrier island by more than 30 years. We came back and we did an assessment of these projects, and you know what? The ones that were storm resistant were the ones that were made of sediment and vegetated. That was a lesson that was learned from Katrina, and we were blown away by that.
There are concerns to be addressed regarding the use of pipeline sediment delivery to rebuild environmentally sensitive wetlands. The right materials, whether fine silt or heavier sand, must be chosen according to the area to be restored. And harvested materials must be monitored for contaminants.
Sediment is relatively clean. We've been studying the sediment since 1977. And it's gotten cleaner and cleaner over the years.
And what about the availability of sediment? The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is constantly dredging the Mississippi River for navigation. Historically, all of that sediment has gone to waste.
We can take dredge spoil from the Mississippi River and rebuild the coastlines. By taking that same dredge spoil, we're in effect are deepening the channel to allow bigger and newer and faster and larger ships to come into the Mississippi River and to the port of New Orleans. And at the same time, the dredge spoil rebuilds the coastal resources that we've lost over the years.
They dredge 70 million cubic yards of sediment out of the Mississippi River annually, out of the Mississippi and Chaffalaya combined. 70 million.
And it just goes to waste.
It's spilled off the continental shelf.
Well, I'll tell you what, that's...
You may ask the question, is there enough material to do it? Absolutely. So we shouldn't even be in that game. We have plenty of material to start the largest coastal restoration program, not only in the country, but on the planet. We look at the history of dredging in Louisiana. It tells us that we need to take that technology, sure, retool it from navigation dredging to restoration dredging, and that's the future.
Unlike the large dredging equipment used by the Army Corps of Engineers, Rainy Refuge has successfully used a small dredge to fill in the small holes in their marshes, somewhat like the holes in Swiss cheese. Without maintenance, the small holes in the marsh enlarge, break apart, and form ponds. This loss of the land weakens the marsh and its ability to sustain wildlife and resist storm damage. The small dredge can be managed by one person. It cleans the sediment out of nearby canals and pumps the sediment over the levees into containment areas where new marshland can be built.
Individual property owners, for some of the larger property owners, probably could afford to rent, lease, or buy one of these dredges and to just, in the daily maintenance of their canals, clean canals out and start to repair marshes before they open up faster.
If you start this process of building up, refurbishing the island, no one should ever consider it as a one-shot deal. You're starting a maintenance program. And so if you just do it once, you've bought some time, but the island will continue to erode and eventually disappear. If you keep doing it, in principle, you can help maintain the island over time.
While all of the lost land cannot be restored, by prioritizing, we can direct our limited resources where it would be most effective.
Not only our wetlands, but wetlands all over the world are some of the most highly economically valued natural systems. We're talking about $20,000 to $30,000 per acre for value for these wetlands. And it's because these wetlands provide services to humans.
One really important concept that people have to understand, they look at the river and it's full of sediment and they go, oh, it's dirty. Well, that dirt's what built Louisiana. It's not dirty, it's soil. It's like what's in your backyard. It's important to understand that that sediment is very valuable to us.
This is an incredibly important ecosystem, not just here for the residents and people and the resources of Louisiana, but really for the nation. The coastal marsh loss has been referred to as a Louisiana problem, but it's a problem that impacts the rest of the nation. If we were losing this much land to a foreign nation, there would be a war over it. And yet we're considering this because it's happening slowly and quietly to be Louisiana's problem.
So, think again. What will you do to help protect and restore the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf coastal region that is valuable to all of us?
Now, I learned some new things from this electronic field trip, and I hope you did too. Now it's time for our expert panelists, Jerome Zarange, as well as Michael Massimi and Karen McGee, to address our questions. And Jerome, I have a question of my own first. Why is silt just being dumped off the continental shelf instead of being used in restoring the coast?
Well, fortunately, we have opportunities to beneficially use dredge material. You heard it referred to in many different ways, but if you're going to use the material or opportunities to use the material to rebuild the coast, we're going to have to do a better job of what we're doing now. Right now, the federal government, the Corps of Engineers, which maintains the channel, the Mississippi River, and the Atchafalaya, there's a federal standard, a policy that requires them to use the most cost-effective method. Well, the cheapest way to do it is just suspend it and let it go off into the Gulf of Mexico. We need to change that. We're using some, but just a fraction of what can be used to restore and rehabilitate our coast.
It really is impressive the amount of silt we're talking about that just annually ends up into the Gulf.
That's right, and all that can be used to essentially reestablish the platform, and that's how it was originally built. We need to tap back into that system.
Something that took thousands of years to create. We have some students, and we're going to hear some questions from across the United States. And our first question is from Leesville, Louisiana, at Pickering High School, and I believe it's Benjamin with our first question. Go ahead, Benjamin. Benjamin, can you hear me? We're doing our best to hear from Benjamin over at Pickering High School, and we are hoping to see if Benjamin can hear us, or anybody over at Pickering High School in Leesville, Louisiana.
Yes, sir.
Hi, what's your question?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, what's your question?
Is it possible to put hay or petroleum-eating microbes in the oil in the Gulf to help clean it up quickly?
Okay, thank you for your question. What do you say, panelists?
I'd take that one. There are actually some products that have been designed specifically for picking up oil that work a lot better than hay. And you might argue that, hay could be inexpensive to use, but, after you grow the hay and bale the hay and load the hay on a truck and transport it to the coast and throw it in the water to soak up some oil and pick up the hay, by that time it's gotten kind of expensive. So there's some effective plastic products, sorbent boom, which can be placed in the water around a slick that absorb the oil without absorbing the water. And that's a much more efficient and effective way to pick up the oil. And as far as microbes, there are a lot of existing natural background microbes that live in the Gulf all the time that do a pretty good job of eating the oil. The BP spill wasn't our first spill. It's not our last spill. We have a lot of other spills. And there's also natural seeps in the Gulf of Mexico. So this oil-eating bacteria is part of the background biota of the system. So adding more really doesn't do a whole lot. It's a little bit expensive also. Bacteria do a pretty good job by themselves.
All right, thank you. We have another question. This time we are going to go out to Alabama. It's Caitlin from Bryant Junior High School in Bryant, Alabama. Caitlin, can you hear us?
Yes.
What is your question?
Why are so many ports in the Gulf when much of the coast is covered by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans?
Were you able to hear that question?
No, I'm sorry.
Caitlin, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Go ahead and ask that question one more time, a little bit louder.
Why are so many ports in the Gulf when much of the coast is covered by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans?
Okay. Why are so many ports in the Gulf? Why are there so many ports in the Gulf of Mexico when there's the Gulf, there's the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans? Certainly there's a lot of population bases there as well.
And that's a good question, but I think primarily where we are, Louisiana is strategically located both for the nation itself but also other opportunities for export and import. A majority of the nation in grain and a lot of the manufacturing facilities utilize the Mississippi River, and at the mouth of the river is the key area, which is in and around New Orleans. There are also other ports within the Gulf of Mexico, which is strategically located to utilize the markets in South America and other countries. But the Gulf of Mexico, majority of why it's there is it's critical because of the river, and it's also cheaper to transport goods and services on barges utilizing the river than it is to go by truck or air. So the port systems that we do have in the United States, and specifically within the Mississippi River, are a vital component to the economy of the nation.
All right, and we thank you so much for that great question. We have another great question coming from, I believe, Stephen at Lancaster Elementary School in Madisonville, Louisiana. And Stephen, what is your question?
Do boats affect the Gulf in a negative way?
Do boats affect the Gulf in a negative way? Wow, that's a pretty interesting question. What do you think, guys?
Bilge water.
I can take a stab at it. Sure. I'm sure what he's referring to is boat wakes, which actually can cause erosion along the edges of waterways. But and that's a concern. But boat owners can drive more slowly in areas that are more susceptible to erosion. But that's a very small component of what's causing our wetland loss.
Would there be any other factors? Maybe just because it's just like cars are sometimes a detriment to the environment. Is there other issues where maybe vessels can pose a negative impact on environments?
Well, the Coast Guard has pretty strict regulations on what they can release and how far offshore they have to be to release certain types of waste on the boat. But I think if I'm not mistaken, the question was probably more to do with the wakes, the erosional effect on the wetlands. But I would agree that that's a really small part of the problem out there.
Stephen, thank you very, very much for that question out of Madisonville, Louisiana. And we're now going to head, I believe, to Mandeville, Louisiana next. Nick has our next question. Nick, can you hear me?
Yeah.
What is your question, sir?
How do marsh fires like the recent one near New Orleans start, and how would it affect the marshland?
Who wants to take that?
I'll take a stab at that. They believe that this marsh fire was started by lightning. But marsh fires can be started in lots of different ways. It is illegal to set marsh fires, but sometimes people start marsh fires on their own. What was the second part of the question? How do they start, and
how does it affect the marshland?
It can be highly variable. It really depends on what the conditions are in the marsh at the time of the fire. Sometimes the water is very, very low if we have drought conditions or low water conditions, and if that fire gets down into the roots and into the soil, it can kill the marsh, and the marsh will not recover from that. If you're lucky enough that your marsh fire is during a time of high water levels, then maybe only the tops of the plants burn. The roots are okay, they're not going to burn if they're underwater, and then that marsh will come back. But a lot of times you hear people say, you know, a marsh fire is good, it always comes back green. Well, new shoots of new growth come back green, but the plants that are lost you don't see. So there may be some new green growth, but the majority of the plants may have been destroyed and you don't see that.
All right, excellent question. Thank you so much. I believe our next question is going to come from Mark at St. Paul's School in Covington. Can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, I can.
Go ahead. What's your question?
The question came from Luke Bissell, one of my environmental science students.
Okay.
He asked, is it possible to develop technology to oxygenate or aerate the dead zones in the Gulf?
Wow, I like that question. What do y'all think about that?
I can
give it a shot?
I can give it a shot. Well, probably that would involve addition of some kind of chemical to release oxygen, and it would also be probably very expensive.
It'd be a big...
I think the better option is to try to prevent the problem in the first place, to reduce nutrients, for example, that are contributing to the hypoxia. Reduce their input into the Gulf.
Okay. I see eyes lit up. Anything you want to add?
Well, in addition to that, and it's obvious we need to reduce the amount of nutrients that are within the system, but I think we're doing some things, and there are opportunities to use the wetlands to reduce or minimize the negative effects of those nutrients, but also help stimulate and rehabilitate some of the wetlands, nutrient assimilation, and other things that we're trying to look at to enhance our ability to restore the coast, or options that we're looking at, carbon sequestration and other things. Any opportunity that we can help restore and rehabilitate our coast could be things that could help minimize the hypoxia issue as well.
That was a wonderful question. Thank you so much. When we talk about the dead zone, it is such a big element to just wrap your head around, and that was a great question. Thank you so much. Now, our next question, we're going to go to Laurelville, Louisiana, and I believe Robert is on the line. Robert, can you hear us?
Yes, sir.
What is your question, Robert?
Would it be possible to build barriers other than barrier islands to help slow the coastal erosion?
Would it be possible?
I would say that it's possible to do that, and in other parts of the world they have, you know, sunk ships or used other material out there as artificial reefs, but whenever you talk about that on Louisiana's coast, you got a couple of problems. One is hurricanes are going to move materials around. Secondly, that's not really what our coastal wetlands are made out of. Our coastal wetlands are made out of sediment. Our marshes have a sediment platform, our ridges are built up sediment, and our barrier islands are made out of sand and sediment. So that's what we need to use to restore the coast, not necessarily artificial structures.
Okay, excellent question.
Also, I could add that it implies that our main problem is erosion from the edges, and a lot of the wetland loss that's occurring is due to land sinking, as opposed to edge erosion. There is some erosion occurring, and that's contributing to land loss. But and building barriers would obviously address that, but it wouldn't address one of our main factors,
still the land
which
sinking.
is the land sinking.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for that question. Our next question, I believe we're going to Mobile, Alabama, Clark Shaw Middle School, and Jay has our next question. Jay, can you hear us?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead. What's your question?
What different things are being tried to stop the damage to the Gulf Coast?
Different things. There are many things that need to be done. Obviously, the limiting factor in most cases is money. And everything from dredge you saw in the field trip, dredging, looking at other opportunities, reestablish ridges and building back the wetlands. But primarily it's tapping into the system that created this environment and this platform. And it costs money to do those things. And I think it's going to take a national awareness or conscious to evaluate how critical this really is. It's not, again, and you've heard it before, it's not a Louisiana problem.
Right.
This is a national problem, a national resource that is valuable in many respects. And so it's going to take a commitment, not just by the people of Louisiana, which we've demonstrated in many respects, but from the nation to help restore and reverse this trend.
I want to thank Mobile, Alabama for that question. Our next question, we're going to Alabama, Hoax Bluff Middle School. And Hunter is on the line. Hunter, can you hear us?
Yes, sir, I can.
Go ahead and tell us your question.
Do you think that in the future deformed animals will appear as a result of the oil spill, like the pollution effects on frogs in Michigan?
Okay, Hunter, thank you. What do you think about that with deformities in the Gulf? What's the chances?
I think it's rather unlikely as a result of the oil spill. Crude oil is a pretty complex bunch of chemicals, but most of it can be metabolized by these animals. You don't really see those sorts of deforming effects like you do with other types of chemicals that may be, eventually from crude oil, but processed much farther along down the line, not just the crude oil, which is mostly able to be metabolized by these animals.
Okay. And time also tells as research
we'll
continues,
find out.
Right?
We'll certainly find out.
Sure. It's a type of developing, it's a good question that continues to have an answer as the research continues as well. We'll continue, I believe, with another question out there. I'm going to look for Camille from St. Pius Elementary School in Lafayette, Louisiana. Camille, what is your question?
Why would people live on the coast even though they know they're risking their life?
Camille, one more time, ask that question.
Okay. Yes, sir. Why would people live on the coast even though they're risking their lives?
Why would people live on the coast even though they're risking their lives?
Well, I know we live Louisiana, in coastal Louisiana. I live in Houma. Mike lives in Thibodaux. I think Karen works at Lafayette, lives in Baton Rouge. We live on the coast, but we live on the coast because you saw the pictures, how beautiful and valuable this resource is. There are some opportunities, vulnerabilities by living on the coast, but the opportunity to utilize the resource. Again, this is a working coast. To provide the resources to the nation, the oil and gas, the fisheries, those resources, you have to have people within the coast to provide those resources. It's not feasible for someone to live in Alexandria to expect to be a fisherman in coastal Louisiana. So, this coast, the people who utilize it live within this coast. But, hopefully we're doing things to minimize those vulnerabilities and protect and restoring the coast. We'll do that.
And I would say the three of you enjoy living on the coast is a factor somewhat as well. Correct?
Sure. Yes.
It's
Absolutely.
a beautiful area to also live in, but with beauty there's sometimes some risks too. So wonderful question. Our next question is going out to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and it is Grace over at Our Lady, Queen of Heaven. Grace, can you hear us?
Hi. Actually, this is Miss Fink. Grace is not here today, regretfully, but she had a very good question.
Okay, go ahead.
She wants to know how Christmas trees can help stop erosion along the Gulf.
Very good question. What do you think?
Take it.
Well, Christmas trees have been used in the past for building a framework that helps slow water movement. And when water movement slows down, the sediment that is being carried in the water drops out. And that addition of sediment helps build up the land.
Okay. And is that practiced much? Is it practiced enough? That Christmas happens every year. So after the year, what types do you think the programs are enough going on, or could there be some more programs like that?
And if you talk to the local officials down in Jefferson Parish on the coast, they'll say it's absolutely working, and they would love to have more. And Christmas trees is a great way that everyone can help participate in helping save the coast.
Well, that's a great idea, and hopefully that can be something to keep in mind as we get to the Christmas holiday season as well. So we are going to go to Huntsville, Alabama. Holly from Whitesburg Middle School has our next question. Holly, can you hear us?
Yes.
What's your question?
What event or natural disaster has been most detrimental to the coast?
Did you hear that question?
Yeah,
okay.
That's a good question. Boy, we've had our share of events and natural disasters. Katrina and Rita together destroyed 217 square miles of coastal wetland, which is almost 10 years worth of loss just in one hurricane season. But if I had to take a pick of what event or natural disaster did the most damage, I might go back to the flood of 1927, which really didn't do a whole lot of local damage in and of itself, but as a result of that flood, we built the levee system on the river all the way down past New Orleans that straitjacketed that river and really disconnected it from the coast, so it no longer adds sediment to the coast as it used to. So that may have sort of put us on the path to where we are now.
Care to chime in?
Well, I think one point to make is that big disturbances like hurricanes can cause problems in some areas, particularly for humans, but these natural ecosystems are actually adapted to be resilient to these types of disturbances. And actually, Hurricane Katrina added a lot of sediment to a lot of the marshes, and that may have a very positive effect in the long run. And a lot of scientists are following that to see how that has affected the ability of wetlands to maintain themselves.
Very, very interesting. I think we might have time for about one, maybe two more questions, and we're going to go out to Patrick F. Taylor Academy in Jefferson, Louisiana. Fatma, can you hear us?
Yes. What are the long-term effects of the oil spill on wildlife and their habitats?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah. And you know, obviously there's exhaustive testing that is going, that's taking place right now. And one of the important messages, at least to take away, is that, you know, the seafood that has, you know, been tested throughout the Gulf of Mexico, it is safe to eat. The long-term effects and the potential, as in Alaska, you know, with the herring fisheries, we're monitoring and making sure that we're going to assess to try to detect any potential problems as soon as possible. There's a lot of testing going on. Long-term problems, again, as Michael said, there have been oil spills throughout time for a long period of time. There will continue to be, but not to this extent. There's no doubt this was a disaster and it had a significant impact, and we're trying to reverse, and hopefully with the help of some of the things that are going on, to minimize those potential long-term impacts. But we'll continue to monitor and assess. But for the most part, the seafood in the Gulf of Mexico is safe.
Okay. We have time for one fast question. We're going to go to Robertsdale, Alabama. Joseph, Robertsdale Elementary School. Go ahead with your question, Joseph, quickly.
How has the ecosystem changed as a result of the oil spill?
Very good question, Robert.
Well, one thing I can say from the standpoint of the marshes and the grasses that form the marshes is that those plants are actually very resilient. They may experience damage initially and their shoots may die, but they have the capacity to resprout from underground rhizomes. There's some areas that were killed by the oil spill. But those, many of those are resprouting, and so that's actually good news. Effects on animals may be more severe and more long lasting, but the good news is that our marshes were only the edges were affected.
Gotcha.
And
well, I want to thank you all for your time to spend with countless children across the Gulf Coast, across the United States, here through the facilities of Louisiana Public Broadcasting. We're just about out of time. I want to thank our guests today, Jerome Zarang, Michael Massimi, and Karen McKee. Thanks for participating, and also thank you for submitting some very thoughtful questions out there. We didn't have time to get to all of those questions, but for those of you on hold, we will answer your questions online. So think again. What can you do to help restore and protect the Gulf Coast? You will find some suggestions at lpb.org/thinkagain. Look for the link, How Can I Help? Once you review the suggestions, make a plan for how you can help and send your plan to edtv@lpb.org, and we may feature it on our website. You can help. You just need to think again. This electronic field trip will be archived and available at lpb.org/thinkagain for your future use. And looking ahead, coming this November to Louisiana Public Broadcasting, we will have a program that is a sweeping look at the groundbreaking science and bold engineering that is challenging the way we view coastal restoration in Louisiana. What is at stake and what can work? Tune in this fall for an important documentary called Turning the Tide. And for more information on that show, just go to lpb.org. For everyone at Louisiana Public Broadcasting, thank you for joining us.